And welcome back to another episode of Flyers Files on 97.3 ESPN.com. Kevin Durso and Haley Taylor Simon are here with you again. And it's been a little while, Haley. We had a lot of activity, holidays hitting, all that type of stuff. We're back, though, for some talk at this point, some talk about the Flyers. And, the last several weeks have been a little rough, obviously. Not a lot of wins to speak of, a lot of games going on, but not a lot of wins to speak of. So kind of has the Flyers where they are at this point, the standings being what they are. And it's been an interesting dynamic lately, where the standings are, because you'd think that after the month they just had, the record that they've had, I think they've got 5 wins in their last 17 games or something like that. It's not great, but yet they're not completely out of a playoff spot either, in the sense that it just kind of has been lets everybody hang around.
Yeah, and that's one thing about the Eastern Conference, especially this season. It has not been good. The West is beyond competitive, but when you look at the Metropolitan specifically, I would say one of the more weaker divisions right now in the NHL.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to paint the picture that they have a great shot or anything like that, because let's face it. As of this morning, following their game against Dallas on Thursday night, which was a 4-1 loss, they're essentially last place in the Metro. They, by points percentage, they are last place in the Metro. They are tied for last in points with a team they're going to see 3 times later this month. So there's going to be a lot of room for movement with the amount of times they play a lot of Metro teams this month. But you get the point. Like, I'm not trying to sugarcoat this in a nice way that they're close to a playoff spot just because they're 5 points out of that second wild card. There's a lot of other teams that they would have to surpass at this point to even make a name for themselves again. So it really kind of has leveled out. They've fallen into place with what they are at this point, I would say.
Isn't it crazy that the Columbus Blue Jackets fall in the top 4 right now in the Metro?
It is a little.
They do really well at home. I will give them that. But I think that just kind of goes to my basic kind of description of what I was talking about initially when we began the episode, Kev, was that you have the Capitals and Devils and the Canes, who are the top 3 teams, obviously, without a doubt. And then you kind of fall off, and then you have teams that are not so good in a sense, filling up the rest of those spots. And I think that just goes to show that while the Flyers are about 5 points away from a playoff spot, it's not necessarily because they're that good of a team. It's just because there isn't a lot of good teams, especially in the East.
Yeah, and that's kind of like, I alluded to this when I was on game night on 97.3 this week, that to me, like, I keep looking at this and I go, half the teams in the league aren't very good. You find these teams that are holding playoff spots with, a team like Boston, for example. They've got a 20-19-5 record. That's a 511 points percentage. But really, if you're reading between the lines here, that's 20 wins, 24 losses in 44 games, and they're in a playoff spot.
Yeah.
That probably shouldn't be the case, but it is, because of just this kind of level of average that's around the league, that there's so many teams that fall into that category. And I lump teams like I said this to somebody else before, and somebody actually asked, ironically enough, from your perspective anyway, asked, is St. Louis one of those teams? And I said, well, kind of, yeah, because they're 20-19-4. And I think at the time, they had played 2 fewer games. I think they were, at that point, then they were 19-18-4. And I said, sure. And they fired their coach this year. Those circumstances also apply, where the number of teams that fire their coach at 500 level, because it's not good enough to get into the playoffs, or it's right on the cusp of getting in the playoffs, and they're looking for that like spark to get them into the playoffs. That's a lot of teams around the league. And then that, like, you have to almost create these tier levels. Like, we always look for, like, who's the elite teams, who is like the tier below that, all that type of stuff, playoff teams, kind of that separating line between contender and just another playoff team. You can take like these 18 teams, I would say, that are like stuck in the middle here, that are average, and go, there's a group that's playoffs every year because they're not bad enough. There's a group that aren't playoffs every year because they're not good enough. And then there's this group in the middle. And same thing, as soon as I said something about being stuck in the middle, the person I'm talking to goes, Philadelphia Flyers. And I went, no, because they haven't made the playoffs in the last 5 years. They're that other tier below.
And the thing I will say, you did mention the Blues, and obviously I covered the St. Louis Blues as well. It's interesting, right? Because the Flyers and Blues get compared to each other so many times. Ever since I began the podcast, I'm telling you, this has been happening. But the difference is that the Blues have a franchise goalie. They have star players like a Robert Thomas, Jordan Kyrou, Colton Parayko, Dylan Holloway, Philip Broberg, right? They have those type of players. When you look at the Philadelphia Flyers, and you have to ask yourself the question, who is their franchise goalie? They don't have one. Who are their star players? Travis Konechny. You can make the argument that Michkov one day will be. But on defense, you would say Travis Sanheim. The point that I am trying to make is that for whatever reason, even though some of these teams have better players on paper, like the Blues, the Flyers end up being, in at least the regular season, I'm going back to last season too, a better team. The Flyers were in contention for all 82 games last season. And I know that they had a really bad losing streak towards the end of the season, which is why evidently they didn't end up making the playoffs. However, I can make the argument that the Flyers need to go after and get some star players. Maybe not a star player, but a franchise type of player, a player that you can consistently see growth in, a player that isn't going to be 30 plus years old. And the number one thing that this Philadelphia Flyers team needs to do is figure out their goaltending situation. I know Tortorella said, hey, we don't know what's going on yet. Didn't say it in those type of nice terms as I said it, but when you have a team that is so dysfunctional, because there's been a lot of dysfunction lately, and it's not Briere's fault. It's not Keith Jones's fault. It is just due to the fact that they have a bunch of players with these awful contracts that they can't get rid of. So they're stuck with them. The team's not getting any younger. And the younger player that they have, Matvei Michkov, he can't fix an entire team at 20 years old. I almost said 19, at 20 years old now. So it is interesting, though, that the Flyers find themselves in a position where they can be, mostly last season, a good team. However, their lack of, maybe it's team dynamic, because they do have good chemistry as friends off the ice, and they talk about that, but that's not going to bring you a Stanley Cup. You need to have good chemistry on the ice. And my rant is almost over, but the last thing I will say is when you have a pair within a Nick Seeler and a Jeremy Drysdale, it does not work. They do not have good chemistry together whatsoever. You need like a Cam York and a Drysdale. And I can go on and on about the lines and the different combinations that have been used this season. But something needs to change because it just looks awful in the power play. Rocky, I don't know what he's doing with these meetings that they're supposedly having, but it's awful, Kevin. And that's the difference. They have good leadership within Danny Briere and Keith Jones. They have a good coach within John Tortorella. But what they lack is having the talent on paper.
Well, and they always were going to. So that's not shocking to me. The hard part with this is that and everything was a patience play when you start talking rebuild. And I was thinking about this the other day because I start to go backwards, and this is a good this week is a good reminder of this to a degree because of a couple different things that are happening that surround one circumstance of this. So this past draft year, they select Jetlachenko. That's a piece for the future. He got a little bit of time up here before going back to juniors. Certainly a long-term play. A guy who looks like he's going to at least at some point factor into your future at that position. Probably not the top guy, but one of your centermen down the line. The year before that, you draft Michkov, which is an obvious key piece of this. And you drafted Oliver Bonk, which was an interesting crossroads here because the way that things happened for Team Canada and World Juniors had a lot of people questioning, is Bonk really good enough? Why not take somebody who played on Team USA instead? Right. And there's always time to revisit the possibilities of what you could have done in the draft later. Then I started to think about it a little further back than that, because every time we come back to a draft conversation, it's Michkov, Bonk, Lachenko. Those are the first rounders we get to talk about. So you go, what was their first round pick in 2022? Oh yeah, that's right. That was a guy who got traded a year ago this week, who's coming back tomorrow.
Yep.
That's one. Who was their first round pick the year before that in 2021? Oh, that's right. They didn't have one because they traded that to get Rasmus Ristolainen.
Oh, yeah.
So, and this is before, and see, that's the thing. This is before Danny Briere and Keith Jones took over in their positions. This
Thanks,
is Jeff
Chuck.
Fletcher's operations. And as a result of that, even though, I get it, you're 2 years into a public rebuild and saying you're rebuilding, and it feels like you haven't done a whole lot to change things over from one year to the next, from last season to this season. It's a lot of the same players, pretty much Michkov's the addition, and that was about it. And now you're looking around trying to figure out where the subtractions are, like, especially if you're in the position you are right now. They're sixth from the bottom in the league right now in standings. That typically is an indicator that you're going to be a seller. But what are they selling? What exactly are they selling when you don't have
Scott
any
Laughton.
UFAs? You have RFAs, but you have RFAs that, as far as I'm concerned, there's at least one, probably two of them that you're very interested in. I don't know if you're going to long-term any of them, but I'd be interested in continuing to see what you could do with Tyson Forster and Cam York going forward. But so they're not part of the movement process. You would want to have guys. The one name that's going to constantly come up is Travis Konechny, because he would have been a UFA at the end of this year if not for the contract extension. I don't think that there was, it wasn't that it was necessarily the right or wrong move to sign into the extension. What I called it at the time was it makes the rebuild harder, because now you're putting even more of a timeline on it. You better get good fast. And everybody's kind of finding out there is no way to get good fast, kind of, unless your players really just develop leaps and bounds above the rest of the league. And they're not doing that.
I think when it comes to players that they can get rid of, and people might think I'm absolutely insane for saying this, and I do not care because I've been thinking about this for a while. Jamie Drysdale, Tyson Forster, Cam York. Younger players that teams might be interested in, that you could potentially get something from them. Owen Tippett would have been one of those guys if he didn't have that crazy contract and extension that they just gave him. Older players, Scott Laughton, Hathaway. But here's the issue. Sean Couturier, even. I would trade Couturier. I'm sorry, but at the end of the day, it's about what you can get back and creating more salary cap. The Flyers have no money. They need to relieve that. So does it suck that this guy was made captain not even a year ago and I'm already thinking, oh, let's trade him? Absolutely not. I thought this offseason they could have done something. My whole annoyance is Tyson Forster. I thought he had a great rookie season last year. He hasn't shown me as much this season, but he has value. There's not a lot of players on the Philadelphia Flyers that have value. They need to get players that have value, but if I'm the Minnesota Wild, random team, I have no idea why I said them, and I'm looking to maybe pick up somebody at the deadline, I'm not going to look at the Philadelphia Flyers and think, oh, this team is going to have players that's going to really benefit my, Stanley Cup contending looking team. So maybe it would have to be a team that isn't as good, like Buffalo. Hey, we could use, Buffalo at least trying to get to the playoffs like in over a decade. We could use a guy like Tyson Forster and they could give you something good in return for it, like draft picks. That's just my 2 cents, because at this point, not a lot of teams are going to take those guys like Ristolainen. They're just not with the contracts and the money. But if you put together the right package and you just go into the trade deadline time and you're just like, you know what? Let's just focus on this rebuild for how it is, relieve cap space, get back assets as in draft picks or prospects or even a good player. Maybe a goalie is a great idea. But if you do nothing at the trade deadline, then I wouldn't call this a rebuild.
Well, you're running out of time to keep calling it a rebuild too. And part of the problem is that see, I'm not necessarily, and I understand, like, you're not crazy for bringing Drysdale's name up because I see it happen a lot, only because it's crazy. A year ago, he comes into this situation, and because of the circumstances, everybody loved him. And now that you're seeing kind of what kind of road it is to maybe try to see how his development goes, it's a long road, especially for a defenseman, especially for a guy who's not a physical defenseman. He's more of the speed and he's mobility, right? That's what his strength should be. It's not there yet. That's and the health is another thing. That's those factors keep coming into play. have kind of, created a little bit of a sour taste for people with this one. I
And
get that. I get that part completely.
but the thing
Then
with
you
Jamie Drysdale is, and I want to ask you, I don't mean to cut you off,
No,
Kev.
go ahead.
John Tortorella said at the beginning of the season that Drysdale has some of the best legs on the team in terms of skating. Realistically, if the Flyers were to, continue to develop and, pursue Drysdale and, have him grow, what role do you think he gets put into? Because on the power play last night, he didn't look good. He just doesn't look good special teams wise. So where do you think he would fit in best? And who do you think that he would be paired up with that would actually make sense and not having Sealer with him?
See, I didn't think the sealer part of it was the problem. I think some of that goes back to what you're asking them to do.
Mhm.
And part of what I think is, for one, I think he's been so used to being used a certain way in Anaheim that it's tough to shake. And even after a year of this, or half a season, and now another, well, partially again, like,
Yeah, because he
there's too
was
much missed time.
injured. Yeah.
That's also what it is. There's too much missed time in there between last season and this season. I worried about his performance this season because of the injury he was recovering from in the first place. It's not an easy thing to come back from. And even though he was supposedly fully healthy coming into camp and all that type of stuff like that, the way that I heard what, as it was being described, what kind of injury it was, it's just something that takes too much time to really be yourself with. And he's had moments where his mobility is really good, and that's got to be his calling card. I don't have a problem with him on a power play. I don't have a problem with him, like, in a perfect world, if he's playing up to what I think his potential is, he should be on a power play. And I think you could probably throw anybody who's a stabilizer next to him, like a Nick Sealer type, honestly, and he should be able to do his job. His positioning is usually pretty off. Sometimes he's gotten out of position a lot.
Very
Sometimes,
off.
and because he's just not that, he's not as defensive minded as some of these other guys are. And I think that it's part of, like I see this with the forwards all the time with, as much as John Tortorella can bring out the best in certain players, and it does happen. Like I think you're seeing that right now with the Forrester Cates Brink line, that you've seen them have games where he's, that style and the way that they've been coached, it brings out the best in them, but it
Yep.
doesn't always bring out the best in everybody. And sometimes I think that guys are not just told, you can say whatever it is you want to say, that we kind of get from everything, and it may not be how it's registering to the player. If To
No, that
me,
makes sense.
like I don't know if the messaging, like, we're being told, I'm not like how many times has John Tortorella said something about with a forward, I'm not trying to turn a guy into a checker. But
All the time.
that's a key part of their identity too. They
Right.
play better when they have more physicality and more forecheck.
Is Tortorella
So
the problem?
it's not that he's the problem. I think it just doesn't translate to certain players that are on your roster, and now you've got to figure out what the hell to do with them.
You know what name I didn't say? I think Morgan Frost will be traded at the deadline.
See, I don't know about deadline. I do think, like, Frost is one of the first names I think that is on borrowed time here. Joel
I don't know.
Farabee's another, honestly.
Yeah, Joel, especially what happened at practice today. Oh, I should explain.
Yes.
So I said it like, yeah. Basically, at practice, Farabee wasn't used much at all in the lines and things like that. So
Right. So there's
yeah,
speculation because John Tortorella said Ola Lixell is playing on
yeah,
Saturday. So there's speculation Farabee's the
be a
guy
healthy
coming out.
scratch.
Yes. So, well, and I think that, and it, like, sometimes that's situational to me. Like, his numbers are down. He has had games where he's gotten good scoring chances, but not finished. And sometimes there's just no explaining it. Like, you're bringing up names that could be traded, especially when you're talking about guys on the younger side. I think that, especially the types of teams you're talking about that might do those deals, those are change of scenery trades to me.
Yeah.
Like, it's, this guy goes here, maybe he gets better, and maybe somebody else does and gets better also, and it works out that way.
Well,
That's the hope.
if you look at the Vegas Golden Knights, not now, but when they first came into the league, and they had a bunch of guys. They called themselves like the Vegas Misfits or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
because they were players that clearly their teams didn't want to protect them during the initial draft that they had, and their not the expansion draft. What's that word?
No, it was expansion. Yeah,
Expansion. That's
when
what
they
it was.
came
I
into the
was,
league. Yeah.
I was thinking of Utah, and I was like, wait, that's not a thing. Long day. But during their expansion draft, obviously those teams didn't protect certain players. Now, I'm not saying a guy like Marc-Andre Fleury, right? is a misfit. No, he still is an icon in hockey with goaltending. But then you have other players like Mark Stone, Carlson, I could go on, but they just needed that change of scenery and they really thrived. So again, I'm not saying necessarily Morgan Frost, if he gets traded to another team, my speculation was the Maple Leafs. Just because of the history with like his dad Andy and the Leafs. And I was like, I don't know, it could be sentimental. But a change of scenery, though, does have the ability to actually showcase that player's true talent. And I don't think a player like Morgan Frost, I think he's going to be one of the bigger names in hockey if he goes to another team. I really do. I think he's become one of those players. Mark my words on this podcast right now, because I was observing him a lot in last night's contest, Kev. He's aggressive by the net. And that's something about him that I think if he gets put on any other team with a coach that truly is able to work with him and they both have a good mutual relationship, I think he's going to be one of those players that people talk about and he's going to absolutely flourish.
Yeah, it's possible for sure. Well, before we get out of here with this, because I don't want to spend the whole show on just rebuild and like completely in general. We've touched on goaltending several times over this, and I think we need to put a little bit more of a specific focus on it because it has been the hot topic lately. Pretty much the entire month of December, just about, and into the new year. So, that whole situation, and one of the things that because again, going back to when I was on game night this week. To me, it's the 3 goalie system that's the problem here, partially. That you shouldn't get through half of a season with 3 guys up on your active roster, and they pretty well have. Like the hold for the 2 weeks before they needed a third guy that they didn't have it, and they had just the 2 guys, and it was the kind of normal circumstances for everybody.
Yeah.
You're back to that. And I understand, like I kept bringing into it because this was Tuesday. This was the second of the back-to-back with the Leafs. And that meant Ivan Fedotov was getting another start. You had Sam Ersson still down with an injury. That was a different story. I understood why a third guy had to be around. But it was getting to that point where it's like when you have Sam Ersson back, whenever that was going to be, and it turned out to be Thursday, I think you have to have the conversation about giving Alexei Kolosov time in the minors. And regardless of what the circumstances are surrounding the whole situation, I think you just need to have that conversation. And I don't know where it's going to go from here completely, because that could have, that certainly by this point, if Ersson was healthy enough to play Thursday, that's a conversation that could have happened already and be the way it is. There were videos going around of this 3 goalie drill they were doing in practice, though. So obviously all 3 guys are still around in some capacity. I don't know if I wonder if I feel like it's too soon to say that the rotation of number 2 and number 3 has completely switched just yet, but I do think it kind of has with the 2 starts Fedotov gave you against Toronto. High-powered offense, gave you a chance to win both games. Don't think there's any, and I know that the numbers didn't look great for him in the second game. I get it. It wasn't a lot of shots, not a lot of shot volume. It also wasn't like I found a specific goal out of those that he needs to have more than from other games. I think those 2 games were not, were a little bit goaltending, but not completely. You still had a shot. Like, it was better than you'd had for a while. The games before, you had at least one, maybe more per game, where it was like, oh, the goalie needs to make a save, and that's a simple equation.
But with Fedotov, my number one problem is, and this is how it's always going to be with him, he has a huge frame, but yet his reaction time is awful. And I think that, he's performing better than Alexei Kulesov, and I'm not disagreeing with you. He should spend some time with the Phantoms, Kulesov, get some, starts in net consistently and just work on his game. But Fedotov, I can't see the future of the Philadelphia Flyers involving Fedotov in this rebuild. I really can't. And I don't mean to be disrespectful to him or, his ability, but he's not a good backup to have at all. And an NHL team, he is not going to give you what an NHL goalie should be giving you. But with what the Flyers currently have, he should be the backup. It's a really bad situation because you can't call up Cal Peterson. No offense to Cal Peterson, but been there, done that. Stay with the Phantoms. And all of our goalie prospects, they're too young. So the Flyers are just in a really bad position. Fedotov at times can be really solid in net, right? I'll give him that. But when you're playing against better teams that are going to be a little bit tricky with, their shots and, try to get in the 5-hole, the 2-hole, whatever, Fedotov can't react to it. And he has such a big body. All he has to do is just react quicker and he can make those saves. And again, for those listening, I was kind of moving around like a goalie would, but Ersson at least has a good reaction time, and that's what I like about him. The problem with Ersson is that sometimes his positioning is just off.
Less frequently than Kolosov. I mean, Kolosov's positioning is awful.
Oh, well, no, he's been way off.
Yeah.
And Ersson, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt because he was out for a little bit with an injury, but I feel bad for Ersson, to be honest with you, Kevin.
Because I've liked his last 3 starts. The 2
I feel
before
bad
the
for
injury,
him.
and then the one against Dallas, I thought he was fine all 3 times. He's given you again.
Yeah.
He gives you a chance to win those 3 games.
No,
Well, and you do win 2 of them. So,
but I do feel badly for him because he's been put in this position where like a lot of blame is on him, and that's not the case at all. You have to look at
right.
the defense who's in front of him. They're not doing their job, and I'm going to go back on this. Ersson was a backup. The Flyers had a franchise goalie. Obviously, he's not here with the team anymore for very obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm.
It's just insane. You think about the Flyers and how there's always been that problem of not having a franchise goalie. You finally get a franchise goalie. A very unfortunate and upsetting situation happens, and this is what's going on. So
It is, and see, what I keep coming back to is that as much as the prospects that they have in the pipeline are way too young to be factors right now, I think it's a long play situation. I see the things that are happening in the KHL right now with their one goalie prospect Yegor Zavragin, and I'm like, that's the long play. That's your Igor Shesterkin long play, and it might take 5 years before he's NHL ready and here and everything lines up the way that it needs to. But that's your long play. And everything that happens in between, like Fedotov's not a long-term solution. To me, he's here until the contract's up. That's it. Kolosov is one I think, like Kolosov's athleticism is a reason to work on the potential and work toward the potential, because I think he has a lot of potential and he's young and he just turned 23. You've got time to allow for that to grow, for sure. It's hard to do in the moment when you feel like, one, that you have to play him at the NHL level, and kind of wonder what would happen if he didn't play at the NHL level, because are you potentially cutting that progression and bringing it to a screeching halt because of the fact that he may just say, I'm going back home then, done, and then that's the last you may ever see of him,
right.
I think Sam Ersson's a nice. I've always believed that Sam Ersson is what I keep coming back to. I call it a capable starter. Doesn't mean you're great. Doesn't mean you're elite. Just means you can be a starter in the league. That's what I keep coming back to. Like I've always believed that when some of the starts I see Sam Ersson make, I go, there are teams with goaltending issues that elsewhere that would take a goalie like that in their tandem. That would add that to, I've got this guy, but I don't want to overplay him. So and I think that's really what the Flyers are looking at also is, yeah, Sam Ersson's perfectly fine to be part of a goaltending tandem. Who's my other guy? Who is my other choice that I can trust to also make 40, 45 starts a season? If I had to, what direction does this go? If Ersson makes, 45 starts a year, who's making my other 37? And they don't have a guy they feel comfortable with that. So Ersson ends up making more like 50 starts a year, or 55 even potentially, because they want to use him because he gives them a shot to win, because that's what they're trying to do. And it doesn't help Sam Ersson any, because it means you're playing way more than you should. So you get tired and you're worn out. And then you're left with the other situation, which is these other 2 guys still have to play, because you are still trying to figure something out. Maybe Fedotov does have a little more than met the eye in the first month of the season.
I doubt it.
I'm not sure, but you might as well. Well, I think where I'm coming from is that
I get where you're coming from.
No, like no one else is walking through the door. You might as well find out. And you might as well do, again, it's kind of like by putting Kolosov in the minors too. It's like, I think you're doing right. Like, whether he's a fan of that scenario or not, I think you're doing right by him to try to give him the best development path for the long-term future also. So that's where I kind of come from, where it's like, then you might as well see what you've got in Fedotov, even if you think you already know the answer, because that would be the guy who's here to back up.
Yeah.
Simple as that. And you're going to play back-to-backs, and you're going to play in situations where you need him as a goalie. So you might as well play him and find out what the deal is. Otherwise, stick to Sam Harrison as part of this equation until somebody else kind of surpasses him, because no one has, and see if you can't keep finding a way to grow Alexei Kolosov's game, because there are things there that I think are positives. There's just not enough of them today for him to be really at the NHL level. That's the problem. It's not that he's not like it's hard. Everybody's going to sit there and say he's not an NHL goalie. Yeah, he isn't today. I agree with that. I do think that there's tools there that can make him one. You just really should see it through the proper way. And it's hard because you do hear about all this other stuff. We're going to do it the proper way with this guy and that guy, and, insert player here, even down to Michkov, right? Michkov gets sat for a couple of games, or he's benched for a period, or whatever the case may be. And there's certain elements of, we got to teach him how to do this, and it's going to be done the proper way, right? It's a little hard to believe that's consistent when what would really be the proper way for Alexei Kolosov? Going to the minors is the proper way.
Right.
And that's it's I'm not saying it's going to be an easy conversation, but sometimes you got to have those hard conversations. That's the nature of the business.
No, I agree with you 100% on that one. So that's like a positive way though, Kev. I actually fully agree with that.
It's probably a great place to end this, isn't it? Considering,
What? I would say so, because this doesn't happen often.
that we're in total agreement.
Total agreement.
It's hard not to be in total agreement about the Flyers goaltending right now. That's for sure.
Right. It's like the one thing.
It's like the one area everybody can agree on. But yeah, so that's probably a good place to wrap it. Obviously, Haley and I are both preparing to cover the next game the team has, which is Saturday night.
Mm-hmm.
We've already hinted at it. Cutter Gautier's. You can't even say return, right? Because he never played there in the first place. So it's his first time in Philadelphia since the trade. That's about all we can say. So, but that first, there's not going to be anything like the first time ever again, right? Like they come back next season, it's not going to have the same kind of quality that it does,
This
and the
is
same
the
kind of
first
energy.
time where fans, and again, like the Eagles play on Sunday. Fans in Philly, they're already fired up about the game, playoffs, and they're going to go to the Wells Fargo Center and boo Cutter, and that's what I'm hearing on the streets. And by the streets,
there were pictures of Flyers fans who were in Anaheim who were like doing the same thing. You could hear it on the broadcast that people were booing him there.
Yeah. He's going to be getting booed like crazy. But Kevin and I, we're going to have a busy day with morning skate in Voorhees, followed by the game. So it's going to be
not that the morning skate is going to really involve anything Cutter related. It's just
a long hockey day.
It's
not even long, honestly.
It's your typical Saturday hockey game. Saturday night hockey game. There's a lot more afternoon ones coming up in the coming months. I know that. So
I hate afternoon hockey games, by the way.
On the weekends, why? Never mind. This is where we're going to end this. Why do you hate afternoon games?
Okay. This is a personal preference.
Well, is it because of the other work though too? Like that you have weekend
my radio job.
And
then sometimes it's so close to each other, and then like I'm out of the house for maybe like 10 hours, and personally hate it. Nighttime games, love.
See, there's a difference, because like for a weekend, if it's free and clear, it's like, give me the early game, please. I love it. But I'll especially love the one that's in against the Devils on the road next Saturday. That
yeah, you're going, right?
I'm at least as that's the plan still as of now, unless something crazy changes in the next week. But a 12:30 start with a being able to take the train up and back super quick. It should be home by like 5:30. It's gonna be great.
Not bad.
Yeah, you can't beat that for a road game. So
you can't.
I think that's where we're going to leave this one. Flyers Ducks on Saturday, Flyers Panthers on Monday, Flyers Blue Jackets on the road on Tuesday. Whole slate of games coming up. It's a busy month of January, and then it's all build up to Four Nations, that big break that they have during the course of February. So we'll be back in another week to talk to you again about some developments and happenings with Flyers hockey. So for Haley Taylor Simon, I'm Kevin Durso. This has been Flyers Files on 97.3 ESPN.